If you are caring for someone else, whether paid or unpaid, and no matter how many hours you do it, did you realise that you may be missing out on thousands of pounds of discounts for things that you may use every day? The Able to Care podcast is proud to be sponsored by the UK's #1 carers card. Started by two best friends who recognise that carers deserve better and are 100% committed to helping to change the lives of all carers and bringing them together as a strong community. Carers Card UK provides support, recognition and rewards. It offers reassurance by providing an ID card that helps access emergency information when needed, while also unlocking discounts, a wellbeing hub, a carers circle tool and a community through their app. All of this for less than the price of a box of chocolates a year. There are discounts on gym membership, days out, electrical goods, clothing and even glasses. Let others know you care while taking a little care of yourself with an ID card you can be proud of. Visit carerscarduk.co.uk/promo code/able to care today to order yours. Welcome back to the Able to Care podcast. Today, we are joined by the guru of mental capacity, Tim Farmer. Tim is a multi-award-winning author, educator, and expert witness who has dedicated over 24 years to supporting individuals with mental health challenges and cognitive impairments. He's worked in settings ranging from community children's homes to high-secure forensic units, giving him a wealth of practical experience. Tim is also a pioneer in the field of mental capacity assessments and has assessed over 3,500 individuals, including members of governments and royal families worldwide. His book, Grandpa on a Skateboard, has become essential reading for many UK universities and colleges, offering invaluable insights into the practicalities of assessing mental capacity. So today we'll dive into Tim's expertise, his journey, and what we can learn about assessing capacity, support vulnerable individuals. We're going to talk about positive risk-taking as well and creating better care systems. So Tim, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Wow, thank you, Andy. Really pleased to be here.
So we connected because I think my book's launching, just as a bit of a plug there. So my book's launching and I think you just commented going, you remember that day of kind of receiving the first. And I don't think I hadn't made the connection. So then I went onto your profile and saw that you were the author of a book that's been sitting on my shelf for quite a number of years that was recommended to me, which is Grandpa on a Skateboard. And it's one I often tell people about when they're talking about mental capacity, going, look, just read this book. It is a real simple guide. So I will just show all viewers, we've got a copy with us there to prove that I did buy it. I didn't just... And it's been sat there for a while. So obviously it's I love the title and it's one of the things that kind of resonated and connected. So what inspired the title and what inspired the book?
Well, what inspired the book was I was aware that there was all the theory out there, right? You know, you got the Mental Capacity Act and all that sort of stuff. But there was a real difficulty, or people were having a real difficulty in putting that theory into practice. And so the idea of the book was, well, let's try and help bridge that gap. Let's try and make it a practical tool that somebody can just pick up and put down as they need. It's not going to bamboozle them with jargon, but it's actually just going to explain it in a clear, simple way that helps people get better outcomes for the people they assess. If you've read the book, you'll know that in there I talk about this guy, John Joe, who is a skateboarder. So he's 84 years old, took up skateboarding at the age of 84 because it was so much like his other hobby of windsurfing. And you can Google him, and in the interview, the interviewer says to him, look, aren't you worried about getting hurt? And he goes, well, of course I am, but that's why I go slowly. I just thought that's brilliant, right? So that helped. And then as I was crafting the book, somebody, one of my feedback group, who was younger than me, used to call me Grandpa, and knew that I skateboarded. And she was like, you've got John Joe in there, you're a grandpa on a skateboard. It would be a really good title. And I was like, oh yeah, it would actually. So that's kind of where it all came from.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It's just something special about the imagery, isn't there? As far as And it kind of ties so well into the idea of the Mental Capacity Act as far as, and we'll go into a little bit and talk about unwise decisions that straight away, and even the imagery on the cover there, I absolutely love whoever did that. Well done to the graphic designer who put that together. As far as that knee-jerk reaction, that there's assumption when people have some level of cognitive decline or some level of impairment, that then immediately creates that risk of, well, they shouldn't do anything dangerous ever again. And the story of Jojo that you mentioned is like, that's it. He used to be a windsurfer all his life. Why does suddenly reaching a certain age or a certain change in his life mean that then he's not allowed to take any risks anymore? Is that something you've kind of found across all the different organizations that you've worked with? Is that something you still find is a real challenge for organizations?
I think it is. And I think certainly in the health and care sector, the real challenge becomes because we have a duty of care. Right. And so it's always drilled into us that we've got to look after this person. In fact, the reason most of us go into care, right, is because we have this thing inside us that say we want to help people, we want to support them. So there is always an apparent or a feeling of conflict with some people around, hold it, I'm here to keep them safe. I think that is an unsafe activity. So how can I let them do it? Right? And I think what we as professionals need to do is help people get over that. And go, look, just because you don't agree with it or just because there's an element of risk to it, doesn't mean they shouldn't be allowed to do it, doesn't mean they aren't allowed to do it. But let's support them to do it in the safest way possible.
Do you think that professionals particularly, and maybe it isn't just professionals as well, it's anybody kind of looking and supporting others, they struggle to look at things holistically? So they focus in on one particular, whether it be the physical risk factor or anything, and they find it difficult to kind of look at the individual as a whole and all the other things that make up that person's well-being, not just whether they fall off a skateboard or not, for instance.
Yeah, totally. And part of that is our cognitive biases, isn't it? Right. So part of that is our own experiences of stuff. I mean, my favorite. If you've read my book, you probably know my favorite quote is from Dr. Seuss. Horton. Here's a who. A person is a person, no matter how small. And I think that is just, if we can keep that at the center of what we do, it helps us to start to take this holistic approach, right? To say, right, it's not just about this. Let's pull in all the different elements and let's see it in the round rather than just focusing on this one element here that maybe makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable.
So when you're doing assessments, obviously you're sometimes going in as an external kind of advisor and you don't always necessarily know all that information. So how do you kind of help and support, whether it be organizations or individuals, to gather that information and kind of look at it from that point of view?
So a lot of it is in the prep work. Okay, so if you think an assessment is divided into basically three areas, right? So you've got your pre-assessment work, you've got what you do during the assessment, and you've got what you do after the assessment. And so before I will even step into an assessment or a meeting with an individual, I will have done a whole load of work around their background, about their experiences, around if they've got any communication issues, if they have any cognitive disorders that impact them. And then I'll be saying to myself, right, what is it they need to understand? How do I put this in a way that they're going to be able to understand it? Okay, whether that's picture form, whether it's audio, whatever it is. I will then take that into the assessment. And then it's very much around those kind of soft, those people skills, right? It's about, are we having the same conversation? I was doing just training yesterday, and we were talking about how there are only three types of conversation, or three types in any interaction. That's right. Am I? And that's, I want to be heard, I want to be helped, I want to be held, right? And so, the way we build rapport and the way we support people is by knowing which conversation they're having and responding appropriately. Okay, so if somebody is in that I want to be heard and they're telling me stuff, then it's not me to sit there and start, right, I'm going to start telling you stuff. It's me to listen and absorb and then work with that. And I think there's as professionals over time, we develop this adaptability, right? Whereas we go in with some expectations or some, I think it's going to be like this. But as it changes, we then change our approach and we mold ourselves, our approach around the other person and how they are engaging. And I think if we can focus on matching that and being kind of flexible within our assessments around that, then that's how we start to really support. That's how we start to engage. And it's, it comes back to this age-old thing, right? We've got two ears and one mouth for a reason. right? Listening is so much more important than the talking.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is that kind of I think there is moments where people forget to listen to the individual themselves, obviously, but also then listening to other individuals around them as well, like making sure whether that be caregivers or whether it be family members. And one of the things I've always felt, and I always kind of think if I reach a point there's a difficulty in my cognition, that my friends probably know me better in some parts than my family, but that they're very rarely ever kind of included within that I've come across as far as being included as far as that assessment process is concerned. Is that something that you try and instigate, or have you come across that, or do you think that is still neglected?
I mean, I think it is neglected, and I think that's a really good point. And maybe it's because we're so used to talking to, the next member, what is it? The
Next of kin.
next of kin, thank you. All the family members, or even when we talk about LPAs, we're talking about the attorneys, and we often tend to forget that wider circle. I know when I do an assessment, when I'm trying to do the pre-assessment stuff, I always go back and go, look, is there someone I should be talking to? Right? Is there somebody else out there that maybe's got an insight or that sort of thing? Sometimes during assessments, or when you're having those meetings, and they might bring in someone else into the conversation, then always be in my head, it's like, okay, after this I need to go and chat to that person and just check that I'm not missing something.
Yeah, I think I think as we're an aging generation, because the nature of our culture has changed quite a lot. That we used to, obviously, mum used to live in the same house or next door, or kids were close by. We all lived in the same community, so therefore family were friends, so to speak. But now we move further away from each other. We build a different form of community, even online communities. Some people, moving into the later stage of life, they probably have online friends that they may never have met face to face. And it's going to be interesting to see how we have to kind of adapt the ability to make assessments to be inclusive of people who may have a better knowledge of the individual's history and preferences than anybody else. That'll be interesting. I suppose we've spoken a little bit about mental capacity here, but there may be some listeners and viewers that actually don't have any idea what we're talking about to some degree or another. So I'd be interested to hear the guru of mental health. This is where the pressure's on, Tim. Summarizing what is mental capacity, the Mental Capacity Act.
Wow. Okay. So mental capacity is really just another way of saying a person's ability to make a decision. So whenever you hear the phrase mental capacity, just think decision making. Okay. So does this person have mental capacity? Do they have the ability to make this decision? And what the Act says, if you are wondering about whether somebody's lacking capacity, the Act basically says, look, we've got, it gives us something called the two-stage test. And it says, these are the sorts of things you need to be looking for. And so it says, right, the first stage is sometimes called the diagnostic test. And it says, is there an impairment to the functioning of the mind or the brain? Now, it's important that we understand we're not looking for a diagnosis. Okay. We are looking for an impairment. And when we think of impairment, think of it's just not functioning right. Okay. So it might be a poor memory, it might be poor concentration, or anything like that. And the reason we're not looking for a diagnosis, by the way, is because we can have the impairment without a diagnosis. So a diagnosis is basically a label that we put on a series of symptoms. Right? So somebody with dementia has been forgetful, has been confused for 6 months, a year before they get that label, but it doesn't mean they haven't had that impairment. Okay, so we're not looking for a diagnosis, we're looking for an impairment. And the Act says if there is an impairment, then we have to see if they can do one of four things. They have to be able to understand relevant information, they have to be able to retain that relevant information, they have to be able to weigh up and apply that relevant information, and they have to be able to communicate that relevant information. Now, the key word there is relevant. Okay, and this is it introduces us to something called the threshold of understanding. Now, the threshold of understanding is what I need to know to make a specific decision, right? And what I need to know, say, to decide to come on this podcast is very different to what I need to know to decide to make a will or buy a house or consent to care. And so that is why capacity is item specific, okay? Because I might have the capacity to come onto this podcast, but I may not be able to make the decision to decide where to live. Okay, so it's really important that, again, when we think about capacity, we don't think you either have it for everything or you lack it for everything. It's very much decision specific. And so when you are, if you are concerned about somebody, then what I'd be saying to you is kind of start at the bottom there and think to yourself, look, are they understanding this information that I think is relevant? Are they be able to remember it, whilst we're making the decision? Can they weigh it and apply it appropriately? And can they communicate it back? And if they can't do one of those 4 things, then you start to go, okay, so what's causing that? Is it maybe they've had a stroke? Maybe they've got dementia. Maybe they're under the influence of drugs or alcohol. And so what's causing that? And if you then have a niggle about that, then that's when I'd be saying, okay, look, you need to go and maybe seek professional kind of advice around whether there's an issue around this particular decision making.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was good. That was a good summary. Well done. Yeah, excellent.
I haven't even talked about the 5 principles yet.
No, I thought we'll get on to those, definitely. I think, so my first question on that is do you find there is some people, that very first thing you said there, obviously the 2-stage test of being some impairment of the brain functioning. Yeah. Do you think there is a misunderstanding of that there is certain professionals and people out there that are confused, that they think a diagnosis has to come first?
Yeah, very much so. In fact, only 3 years ago now, 2020, 2021, I was giving evidence in court. And the barrister kind of said to me, you're not a doctor, therefore you can't diagnose, therefore you can't do the first part of the 2-stage test. And I put him right in court. And the judge agreed. And then kind of since then, there's been other case law. And so the courts now very much say, look, we're not looking for a diagnosis. We are looking for an impairment. But I think, this is yet to filter through the system. People often will go, they've got dementia, therefore they can't make the decision.
It works both ways, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Either they haven't got a diagnosis, so therefore they have capacity, or they have a diagnosis and therefore immediately then they don't have capacity. And that 2-stage test is not being done effectively. And as you said, it's the inability to affect that particular choice, not just blanket choices.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's definitely one of my bugbears. And I know that I've spoken to other kind of experts in the field as well. And that blanket term of they lack capacity really grates.
Absolutely grinds my gears. It really does. It's so frustrating. And the other thing that often comes from that is this, this ignoring of the first principle. Right? And so the first principle says we have to assume the person has capacity, right? And just having that label of they've got dementia, therefore they can't make the decision, just totally overrides that. Now, I know we weren't going to talk about the 5 principles, but while we've got the first principle on the table.
All right, you go for it.
Yeah. So the way, people often kind of get confused around this, and say, well, why do we start there? And the way I explain it is like, look, if you were to walk into a solicitor's office or the GP, before you'd even open your mouth, they went, Andy, you lack capacity. Oh, how annoyed would you? I tell you, I'd be right round off. I'd be so angry that before I've even said a thing, you're writing me off. So if that applies to me, if that applies to you, Andy, it's got to apply to everyone, right? And, if we then take that one stage further, if somebody said to me, before we let you make the decision, Tim, you've got to prove that you can do it. I'd be, well, why should I? Why should I have to prove it? Surely you should be the one proving I can't. So again, if that applies to me, got to apply to everyone, right? And I think, people often lose sight of that's where we're coming from. And so the onus is not on the person to prove to you they have the capacity. The onus is on the person challenging it to prove that they don't.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the golden rule, isn't it? As far as do as you would be done by kind of premise in there, that tomorrow I could have an acquired brain injury, I could have an accident, therefore I've got an impairment of brain functioning to some degree or another. But the brain's pretty complex, and therefore in what part? And therefore maybe I can't communicate, but I can still make decisions. Maybe I can't hold long-term memory, but can still decide what I want to eat today and things like that. So,
this brings in another concept, right, within mental capacity. It's called the causative nexus, sometimes called the causal nexus. And what the Act tells us is there has to be a direct link between the impairment and the person's inability to do stuff, right? To be able to make that decision, to be able to meet the threshold of understanding. And if there is no causative nexus, if there is no link, then we have to presume capacity. I'll give you a very quick example of this. I was once asked to assess a lady. She was in her 60s. When she was 50, she was knocked down by a car, had a brain injury, was put under the court of protection because she was deemed to lack capacity to manage her property and finance. And when she was in her 60s, she was saying, "Look, I think I've got the capacity to come out from under the court. I can manage my finance." I spoke to the deputy that was managing her finances, and he said, "Look, she's really reckless with money. Right? She's got $2 million in the bank. If she gets her hands on it, she'll blow the lot." So we did what we call the pre-morbid history. Okay, so what she was like before she had the brain injury. Now, when she was 24, she inherited £500,000. Okay, now, Andy, do you know how long? Can you guess how long it took her to spend £500,000 when she was 24 years old?
It would take me a while unless I was really quite determined. But I'm assuming by the way you're phrasing it that she got through it fairly quickly.
2 weeks.
Wow.
2 weeks. Right? She bought a sports car. She bought first-class flights around the world, 5-star hotels. Her view at the time was, I might get knocked down by a car tomorrow and then I won't be able to enjoy it. So I would rather have the instant gratification and enjoy it now than wait. Right? I will always be able to earn money. So actually, the person looking after her finances now that she's 60 was absolutely right. She would blow the lot, but not because of the brain injury, right? Because of her view of money, so there was, obviously there's other stuff involved in there as well, but there was no causative nexus. Right? There was no link between the brain injury and her wish to just spend money and get the instant gratification.
That's brilliant. That's a really good example. That's a really good example. Absolutely. So it's looking at, if we take away that cognitive impairment, would they have made this mistake anyway or made this choice anyway? And that goes back, I suppose, to the grandpa on a skateboard, isn't it? He was a windsurfer. So therefore, he would have made that decision whether he had a condition or whether he had any kind of cognitive impairment or not, because he enjoyed high-risk activities. So if he wants to jump out of a plane, he would have done that when he was younger. So why shouldn't he be able to do that now? He enjoyed risk-taking. And that right shouldn't be taken away just because there's now been something that's happened. That's really, really interesting. And that's a great way of that's a great story. I like that one. Really, really good. So it's, okay, we'll carry on. Because we started, we might as well kind of carry on through the 5 principles. So the first one, as you mentioned, we assume capacity in every decision a person makes until proved otherwise. Second one, if I get it right, is we allow the person to make the decision as best they can. Is that the second one? Am I getting
supported decision making?
Supported decision making. That's
and what the Act tells us is that we have to support the person, take all reasonable steps to support the individual to make the decision. Okay, so I'm going to take you back to, you've walked into the solicitor. Thankfully, they haven't just told you outright that you lack capacity, but you're there. You're thinking about, I don't know, let's say buying your first house, and you sit down in front of them, and they just stare at you and say nothing, and you're there going, "Well, I need to understand stuff, right? I need information before I can make this decision." So this whole supported decision making is about, well, we need to give people the information to see if they can make the decision. I can't remember the bit of case law, but it talks about not expecting people to work from a blank canvas. And that is like, we can't expect everybody to know everything about everything. So our role, really our role is to show people at the best that they can be. And so in order to do that, sometimes we have to give them information, right? We have to give it in a way that they can understand. And it's not only how we give information, but how they can impart information back. So I often do assessments with people with brain injuries, or who've got impaired verbal communication that can only indicate yes or no, right? Yes, looking up with their eyes, no, looking down, or whatever. And so my job then is to say, well, even though you've got limited communication, I need to support you to be able to show me if you can understand this information, if you can weigh it up, if you can apply it. And actually, there are a couple of really good tricks to this. So if people can only answer yes, no, there's something I use, and I call them option questions. I'm sure there's a better use for it like that. But it's basically, I will say, let me give you an example, a case study. So I went to see somebody who could only indicate yes by looking up and no by looking down. And it was around a lasting power of attorney. So a lasting power of attorney, for people that don't know, is when you appoint somebody you trust to make decisions on your behalf. And so I said to this person, do you know what a lasting power of attorney is? And they looked up yes for yes. And I was sitting there going, well, how do I know that you are not thinking about taking your car to the garage? So I said to him, is a lasting power of attorney about taking your car to the garage? He looked down for no. So, okay, is it about leaving stuff to somebody when you die? He looked down for no. So is it about appointing somebody you trust to be able to make decisions on your behalf? He looked up for yes. So you see, even though he couldn't tell me verbally, I was able to identify that he understood it. And that's when we talk about the supported decision making, that's what we're talking about. It's about how do I support you, not only to understand it, but also to be able to communicate it back, to kind of engage in this whole decision making process. Now, the Act doesn't expect us to do everything, but it does expect us to take reasonable steps.
I like that as well. It's almost like providing a multiple choice question, isn't it? So is it A, is it B, is it C? Is quite a good way of filtering down and clarifying and understanding. Because I think, again, there's always a danger. Human beings are terrible at making assumptions, especially when we're in a rush. And therefore, like, do you agree? Yes. Therefore, that's it, done my job. But that's where there's a vulnerability, isn't there? As far as, have I actually showed due diligence as far as ensuring this person did fully understand what I said? I'll tell you, I've spoken about this on a podcast before, so I won't go into too much detail as far as, but I use a tool when I'm teaching about mental capacity in this section is just the sweets, the chocolates, foiled chocolates, random non-brand foiled chocolates. I say, which one would you like? Can you make an informed decision? No, because you don't know this brand. You don't know what they all mean. Now, if I was to then provide you with a key saying purple's this one, green's this one, etc., would you be able to make an informed decision? Most people say yes, but what if you can't read? What if English isn't your first language? What if the room's really dark, meaning you can't see the colours properly? What if I'm rushing you? What if I'm trying to persuade you and you should have a blue one? Yeah, definitely try a blue one. You'll like the blue ones. And we can really go into this quite in-depth kind of analogy of just taking something as simple as like choosing a chocolate that we take for granted, but are you providing the information in a way that that person can understand, and it's adapting that information? Because if I wrote well, I'll tell you what they are, but there's a list of 50 sweets. Well, somebody with dementia might be able to choose between a toffee, soft toffee, and a hard toffee, but giving them 50, not going to remember the last one by the time they get the first one.
I love that, Andy. So, I love that. I might steal that.
You're more than welcome. I've given it to others, and we're here to support. Because again, it's just that I think although the idea of we take for granted that making our own decisions is something we do and we just do it and it feels simple, taking that responsibility, it should be a simple process as long as it's approached analytically, appropriately. But there's quite a level of responsibility to it. It's yeah. And I think as you've mentioned a few times, there is a lot of assumptions that are kind of made. So let me ask you a question. Do you ever find the pressures of supporting, teaching, or caring for someone else overwhelming and wish you had access to more support and information? The Able to Care podcast, in connection with Able Training, has created the ablehub.uk, where for less than the price of a coffee a week, you can access exclusive podcast content, resources, events, and over 45 certified online courses, covering topics like self-care, understanding dementia, neurodiversity, first aid, conflict management, financial advice, and so much more, with new content and courses being added each month. We are so confident that you will benefit from the Able Hub that we are offering 14 days access completely free of charge. No contract, cancel anytime. Become part of the ablehub.uk community and gain the support, knowledge, and resources you deserve. Don't struggle alone. Be able. Find the link in the description. So the first two steps, we assume We then help them and support them with appropriate information in an appropriate way for them to make that decision themselves.
Yep.
Number 3, I believe, is then unwise decisions.
Yes.
Okay, so
Yes.
well, let's talk a little bit about unwise decisions, because this is the one that always comes to mind related to your book as well. That is kind of that, why shouldn't I do something? You don't think it's a good idea, but who are you to tell me what I shouldn't do? And I always use, like, there's quite a lot of smokers in the health and social care sector. And therefore, I sometimes raise that as, should I assume because you want to smoke that you now lack capacity because you know it's bad for you, right? And it's exactly that, isn't it? That we all make decisions that sometimes from an angle could be unwise for us, but there must be a benefit to every behavior we do. So it has to be kind of weighed up. So do you find that's a big challenge, the unwise decision and we'll talk about positive risk taking as well related to this. Yeah. Is that one of the big challenges you find within settings, organizations and people?
I think it is. I mean, if we define an unwise decision, it's basically a decision that I would make that's different to you, but based on the same body of evidence, then the reason that I'm calling it unwise is because I don't think it's wise. And so if I'm there going, well, I now allow you to make a decision that I don't think is wise, even though I'm supposed to be in this role of caring and keeping you safe, how does that work? And then you throw in there, what if something happens? Am I going to lose my job? Am I going to go to court? And suddenly we get all this fear built up around it. And people inherently go, right, you can't do that. And that's it, without really understanding that we all make unwise decisions. It's a fundamental right. But what actually makes what makes an unwise decision? Right? I mean, you gave a really good example of smoking as an unwise decision. But what makes an unwise? Can you give me a definition? And quite often when I say to people, can you give me a definition? They're like, oh, no, not really. So for me, the way I view it is I think there have to be two things present, right, in an unwise decision. First of all, as you spoke about, there's the risk. Okay. And so the person has to be able to understand and appreciate the consequences and the risk associated with taking the action, but also not taking the action. Right? And being able to kind of weigh that up and apply that appropriately. And I think for me, the other thing is there has to be kind of a logical or a sequential series of steps that gets us from this body of evidence to the outcome. Right? In mental health, we talk about Knight's move thinking. So I don't know if you play chess, Andy. I don't know how many of your listeners play chess, but in chess, all the pieces, apart from one, move in a direct line. Right? So they move horizontally or vertically or diagonally, but there's always a direct pathway back to the place they started from, with the exception of the knight that moves forward 3 and across 1. And there is no direct pathway back to the start. And so I would say an unwise decision, there needs to be that direct link, right? We can't have this knight's move thinking where you come to a conclusion over here that's not related to the starting point. And so I think it's those two things that we really look at to say, are they in place? Now, if they are, then we start to say, okay, that this is an unwise decision, right? If they're able to understand, retain, and weigh up and apply the relevant information. But if one of those two things are missing, like certainly if they're not appreciating the risk or the consequences, then we start to go, actually, this is an incapacitous decision as opposed to an unwise one.
Right.
Does that make sense? Have I thrown stuff out there? Feel free to come back, right? If you don't agree, if you think, actually, I think we're missing something there or there's something off there, please do throw it back, because that's what this is all about, right? It's about us learning and kind of developing and growing stuff.
Yeah, no, I think what you said is 100% spot on. I think it is just it's as you said, the cost benefit analysis, which is essentially that's my terminology I tend to use. As you said, it's the kind of the risk, and it's getting back to the I suppose I suppose I just think I struggle to, or some people struggle to kind of weigh that, because especially even when it comes into the best interest, these are two elements that kind of very close connected, aren't they? As far as the best interest assessment, as well as the what is unwise, they're kind of looking at it from two opposing points of view in some way. If I'm taking a decision on somebody else, I need to weigh up the cost benefit of whatever I'm doing. And I think it feels to me that there's so many factors that you have to consider. As we said, the whole holistic approach. But I think that's something that people find really hard to do, and definitely hard to record as well. So what's the way that you kind of approach that and go about it?
Well, I think it comes back to this fundamental, the person is the person, no matter how small, right? And so we start with this individual at the center, and we build out around that. And then when they're looking to make this decision that we might think is unwise, we then have to say, right, well, so why do I think it's unwise? Right? Where's my niggle with this? Okay, now, why do they think it's okay? And where internally for me, where does that jar? Now, why is that?
Yeah.
And is that a me thing, or is it because actually they don't understand that jumping out of an aeroplane without a parachute is going to lead to their death? They can't fly, no matter how many times they tell me they can. And so I suppose for me, that's personally how I go about trying to balance that. And I think the other thing to remember, you mentioned about making a best interest decision, right? And people do often say, well, hold it, how can I make a best interest decision? If I've got to act in their best interest, how can I allow them to make an unwise decision? The fact that I think it's an unwise decision means I don't think it's in their best interest. Otherwise, I'd be calling it a wise decision, right? But the thing to understand with that is they happen at a different point on the capacity timeline. So you can only make an unwise decision if you have capacity. You can only act in someone's best interest if they lack capacity. So there should never be that conflict, right? You should never find yourself going, they lack capacity, I'll make an unwise decision. Well, they lack capacity, so you've got to act in their best interest. Or they have capacity, I'm going to act in their best interest. Well, you can't do that, right? Because they have capacity, so you've got to make that unwise decision. I still quite often I will see in reports from hospitals, care homes that said, this person has capacity, so we're going to have a best interest decision meeting. Well, you can't. Right?
No,
right?
yeah.
If they have capacity, they have capacity. Right? There is no best interest decision making.
It's mind your own business time at that point.
Yeah.
100%. I think you summarized it really well there, actually, Tim. It was the Bill said it's self-evaluate, isn't it? Being very mindful and aware of your own values, beliefs, and attitudes to what you think is right and wrong and good and bad, and what people should or should not do. So you need to be kind of quite self-aware when you're doing that kind of capacity assessment, kind of recognizing your own biases, you mentioned earlier, and prejudices, and kind of just go, okay, well, it's not something I agree with, but it's not me. So it's things like, I use the example of things like personal care, for instance. So most of us typically tend to have a minimum of a bath or a shower every day because we feel more comfortable with that. But that isn't a law. There's not a universal law that's stated in some kind of dogma that you must have at least one or bath or shower a day to maintain. And we know that if you don't have a bath or shower a day, you're probably not going to be ill. You probably, if it was a really hot day, it might impact on you socially, but it'd be significant before that point. But that's where I think sometimes care professionals and caregivers generally going, but they need to be because, and it's their values that they're trying to impose on somebody else. Whereas again, that's where looking at, well, how often did they used to bath or shower? What's their previous history? Do they like bathing or showering? And looking at all of the kind of and how much does it matter? What's going to cause them more distress and disturbance as well?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. What's going to cause them more stress and disturbance? Forcing them to have a shower when they really don't like it. And that I suppose leads us into then the fourth element, which is the least restrictive. That if we are then obviously, having to take somebody's choice away from them or make a decision on their behalf, then obviously whatever choice we're making needs to be the least restrictive. So if we take the hygiene example further through, then I would kind of say that if they don't like bathing or showering, maybe it's to do with, getting naked in front of other people. Well, can we just do a bed bath and minimize kind of thing? Because that's then least restrictive, but we are going to have to enforce that. We're going to have to take that choice away. But how often do we then have to do that? Is that something you have to create and work with organizations on to help them?
I tend, because I specialize in the assessment side, I have the lucky bit, right? I swoop in, I say, yes, they do have capacity. Now you go and sort it out. So I rarely get involved in that latter bit these days, but certainly in the past, when I used to work in the care homes and in the hospitals and that sort of thing, it'd be very much that, right? we are now making decisions on your behalf in what we deem to be your best interests. How do we do that has the least impact on your rights and freedoms? Okay. And very much like you said, that's taking into account, what they would have been like before, and the need as well. Like, do they need to wash their hair every single day? No. Right? Do they need to have the shower every single day? Whatever. And it's kind of getting that balance between, you talked about the cost benefit analysis and all that sort of stuff. I think, there are an awful lot of good professionals. I'm a little bit worried that we're sitting here going, everybody does it wrong and you're all rubbish. But there are loads and loads of really, really good professionals out there that get this absolutely spot on, like, are really, really good about this. And I think, it is important that we acknowledge this. I think also sometimes the system they're caught in, right? They have their care plan that says this person gets washed every day. This person does that. This person does that. And you get these people that are there going, I've got to do it because that's what I'm told and that's what it's in the system. And so I think, it can often be quite difficult to change this within organisations. And sometimes you've got to really start at the top, haven't you? And say, look, let's change this view and let's help it filter down from the bottom up and empower those on the shop floor to have the knowledge, to have the autonomy, the skill, to be able to make these decisions at the moment, to say, so is really, really upset. They might be touch sensitive. Actually, if I now have to get them in the shower, that's going to make things worse. They had a shower yesterday. They're not smelling. Their hygiene's good. Let's just leave it, right? Let's leave it for today.
And I think you're 100% right. There is, when we're looking at things like mental capacity, most people are coming from a place of genuine, as you said, they've got that duty of care and they came into the industry to provide that duty of care. But I think what you said there is sometimes this, because it's written down, that's now what we do. And obviously we know that a person is going to change over a period of time. Like, I change my mind from week to week, day to day, sometimes hour to hour, Tim. And therefore it can sometimes feel an unflexible system to allow that accommodation. But I think you mentioned there kind of making sure that caregivers, and whether that be family members who are caring for a loved one, as well as and watching out for their loved one if they move into the care system, as well as those who are actually doing the caring and paid caregivers. So they do have that kind of understanding around this to kind of be able to go, this doesn't feel quite right, or I think we need to be doing more, or whichever.
And I think also, sorry, Andy, I'm just going to jump in.
Go for it.
I think that's reminded me of another point, that the capacity is not a once done, right? People's capacity can change, right? And there may certainly, if somebody's, say, got a urinary tract infection or, something like that, they may go through a period of confusion where they lack capacity. But then once that infection is resolved, the capacity may well return. So I think it's really important as well that people understand this, are empowered to be able to go, okay, at this time, they may not do it. But if their presentation changes, well, we revisit that and we look at that again.
So we've gone through kind of the full journey. We've gone the 2-stage test and we looked at the 5 kind of principles. What would you say, kind of, I know we've touched on a few examples, but what are the biggest challenges that you find that, whether it be family or caregivers, find when it comes to the mental capacity that maybe is simpler than they realise?
So I think the first thing is, what is the actual decision we're looking at? Okay, because sometimes we might go, it's health and welfare, right? And can they make decisions around their health and welfare? Now, health and welfare covers whether they take medication, whether they can have contact with somebody, decide where to live, consent to care, all that sort of thing. And it might be that they can make decisions around when they take the medication, but they can't make decisions around contact. And so by lumping it all into one, right, we're writing everything out, ruling everything out. So I would always say, right, let's break it down. What is the specific decision we're looking at? And let's look at that. The next thing then is, what is it they need to understand? Right? And spend time working this out. Because if I don't know Andy, if I don't know what you need to know to make a decision, how can I work out if you know it? Right? And how can I work out what I need to do to support you to understand it? So, so for me, it's then going like, what's the decision? What do they need to know? People sometimes get hung up on this whole thing around fluctuating capacity, right? They have it in the morning, they have it in the afternoon. Another really important thing to understand is the decision what we call a micro or a macro decision? Now, there's a great bit of case law, 2012, ABC versus XYZ. I love it. It's the sort of thing my 7-year-old would come up with, right? But in that, the judge says we have two types of decisions. We have macro decisions, so ongoing decisions where at any point in time, a person may need to make a sudden or unforeseen intervention. And these are things like health and welfare, like property and finances. Or we have these one-off decisions, which may be, do I have Weetabix for breakfast? Making a will. And the way we do the macro decisions is we take a longitudinal view. So it's not just how does this person present to me right here and now, but how are they presenting over time? And over the long period of time, do I think on the balance of probabilities, they're more often not going to be able to make this decision? If the answer is no, then we say they lack capacity. Now, the micro decisions are in this space of time, can they make the decision? So what do I need to do to get them in that best space, right? Familiar environment, best time of day, impact of medication, all that sort of stuff. And I find when I talk to talk to assessors, I'm just understanding whether it's a micro or macro decision and how we interpret stuff really helps in this. Okay, right, what am I taking, the immediate view, the longer term view? So I suppose for me, they are the top three things. Specific decision, know what it is they need to understand. And is it the snapshot here and now you're looking at? And if so, how do you best support them? Or are we taking that more longitudinal view?
That's great. That's a great little summary of those three. I like that, Tim. So before we kind of started recording, we did chat about something related to unwise risk taking. I know you were part of it, and I think we'll just touch on it. There is we're going to be talking about self harm, so I'll put a kind of a trigger warning in just here, as far as just make sure you're taking care of yourself related to this subject. So one of the places you worked, when we're looking at unwise decisions plus best interests, it all comes under that kind of bracket, doesn't it? So the positive risk taking, and I believe it was related to you worked in an organisation related to eating disorders. Is that right? I think that's what you said, isn't it?
Eating disorders and self-harm. And we looked after treatment, what was known as treatment-resistant young adults, predominantly females at the time. When we say treatment-resistant, it was they weren't responding to the normal approaches in the NHS. So within that, right, we automatically had to be creative and go, the normal way doesn't work. And before my time, we obviously carried it through. They started to really come up with this notion of the harm minimalisation. So rather than go zero tolerance, where we go, no, you can't self-harm at all. It was that by doing that, all that does is it drives it underground and it makes it worse, right? If you think about a Coke bottle, right? You shake it up, and the more you shake it up, the bigger the pressure builds. Eventually, when that top comes off, it's boom everywhere. And so it was that acknowledgement that, look, people are going to have to do this because it's their coping mechanism, right? At the moment, this is the way they cope with all those horrible thoughts, those horrible feelings. So rather than saying you can't do it, how do we work with you so that you can do it in a safe way whilst we build in all these other strategies to help you eventually, hopefully, have things that are not as risky to you to manage with all these things. So we came up with this, this whole concept of harm minimalisation, which, Andy, I know that you're well versed in, and you know an awful lot about.
Yeah, I find it a concept that some people really struggle with, though, because I think there is many people that, because of, again, this is where we're going back to being very mindful of our own values, ideas, beliefs, and attitudes towards things like kind of self-harm. And I remember it was, this was an unusual thing for anybody to say, but we were talking about the harm minimization kind of strategies of cut kits and things like that. And this guy said, "Oh, I think if somebody's going to do that to themselves, they need to be locked in a padded cell." And and it's like, well, I don't think that's going to improve their self-esteem and well-being and improve their strategies of coping with difficult emotions. So that seems like a short-term solution that's going to create a much bigger long-term problem, as you said. But it's that counter to, but I use an analogy sometimes related to that, a bit like the using clean needles for heroin users, for instance. Going, look, they are going to use. We want to minimize the risk while we're helping them and helping to overcome this. So let's get them at least using clean needles rather than dirty ones to start off with, and then we'll work from there. So the same with if we are looking at self-harming, we use a clean blade rather than a dirty blade. But we don't just stop there and go, and that's it, that's what you do now. We're constantly working with them to then look at alternative strategies and giving them tools. And we chatted before we came on properly about the food colouring, or the Ribena in an orange was the one that I hadn't come across before. I've just done food colouring in an ice cube. To give an alternative of kind of cutting the oranges, give similar sensory input, and the melting of it gives similar sensory input, psychosomatic kind of benefits and things like that. But yeah, it is and I think there's another one related to, so eating disorders, I know, is a very difficult and complex one when it comes to mental capacity as well, because again, there is it, some people still don't class it, or I think I remember two dolls cases where the outcome was completely different in two separate dolls cases, almost identical, with individuals with eating disorders, reached a point of we need to force feed, otherwise they're not going to survive. And in the two cases that went to court, in one, the judge said, yes, you can take that choice away and force feed. And the other one felt that they had capacity and therefore couldn't take that choice away and unfortunately died. So that sounds like very complex, as you said, situations to kind of deal with. Have you come across a lot of resistance, even within that organization, when you were putting these things in place, that people really uncomfortable with it?
Yeah, well, yes, and it's our own anxieties, right? Our own anxieties are, what is the worst that's going to happen if I put this in place, right? And then, what happens to me as a result? I don't want to be the one responsible for this young person dying because I've let them have a blade, or that sort of thing, And when I set up, I helped set up liaison psychiatry services in Gloucestershire. I know I tried to start to bring in this whole idea of harm minimalisation onto the wards, but very much the nurses were like, and I understand it, right? And also the hospital directors and all that were like, you are saying that this kid wants to self-harm, so we're going to give him a razor blade on our ward, and then God knows what's going to happen. No way. How can we do that? How can we possibly overcome that concept? And I think, it is really, really difficult. And I think when we do that, we have to be mindful of how other professionals feel about it, and their anxieties and their worries and their concerns. And it's almost, that we are working with two people at once, right? Not just the individual that we are trying to help, manage what they've got going on internally, but then we're also trying to help and support the staff team to manage what they've got going on internally about the whole thing, right? And yeah, and that, I think that's why it becomes so difficult, because I would love to say that, yes, by the end of it, every time I gave the girl a razor blade, I was like, yeah, that's fine, off you go, without internally going, oh my God. But it's about how we manage it, right? And how we learn to manage that. And it wasn't, I would just say, we didn't just say, here's a razor blade, off you go. Right? There was very, very strict agreements around it. So, we would have, if I speak about one thing that I remember, for example, we would work with the individuals and we would have a series of steps that they would have to go through, right? So we would have, say, 12 other steps that they would have to go through first before they would have, for example, a razor blade. And then we'd say to them, right, you can do it in your room for half, and you have 30 seconds and you can make 2 cuts, and they can only be so long or so deep. And then after that, we're coming in. And invariably, the first time you did it, right, there was cut everywhere. And then the conversation is, why didn't that work? Right? what didn't happen? What didn't go wrong? And you'd go right back to the start of the first 12 and go, did that one work? No, why not? Because of this. Okay, let's change this. Let's change that. Maybe you're not at the right stage then for us to be able to let you have the razor blade by yourself. But if you are, maybe asking you to cut twice is too much. So let's start with 3 and work towards getting it down to 2, and then work towards getting it down to 1, and then work towards not doing it. So it's not, it's part of a whole process. And I think also when people understand that whole process and the reason behind it and why we do that, it starts to become easier rather than just go, here's a razor blade, off you pop.
I talk a lot about that already in behavior stuff that I do, that it is sequential. Change takes time. You can manage it from the moment go, but change takes time. And I think there's so many people who just go, well, I should be able to click my fingers and stop that or change that or do that. And that's just not. So it's a bit like losing weight. You don't just go, I'm going to lose weight tomorrow and that's it. It just all falls off. It's going to be, okay, so I'm going to create a plan and I'm going to try this and try that. And we'll lose a little bit and then we don't lose a little bit for a while. And then let's change our strategy. And it's a journey like anything else. And if we have to do that for ourselves, any behavior is going to be exactly the same along those lines, isn't it? 100%. Yeah, that's a great example. And it's an interesting area, I think, that people do panic about. And there's loads of different situations and environments where obviously even this is a challenge for them people under the age of 16 as well, which we'll have to talk about another time. But when it comes to making decisions on behalf of them, because there isn't it's a different framework in place. But as soon as they've hit 16, we're going into this mental capacity assessment. And at least we've got this tool and framework that we can kind of, as professionals, work from. And we'll have to talk about dolls at another time at some point, and maybe get you and Lorna, another lady that I chat to about this particular subject, in a room together, and we'll moan about dolls. So before we finish, one of the things that I've loved about the conversation with you today, Tim, and it kind of is reflected in the book as well, that you've got all these amazing case studies and experiences that you've kind of come across on your journey and your working life, as well as some of the cases you've evaluated. And they're in the book to kind of give it that really kind of personable approach. And I relate to that because that's what I like to do in mine as well. But it does make it a very easy read and a kind of way that most people can kind of take and pick up and dip in and dip out of and kind of get their head around certain concepts. But I hear that you are working on another project, another book. So tell us about it.
And you'll be able to help us with as well.
Well, yeah. Yes, if I'm asked, I'll be there.
Yeah, so I'm currently, and it's an idea I've had for a while, about writing a book about assessment. Because I don't know about you, Andy. Nobody really ever taught me how to assess. Right? I was given this bit of a tool and that bit of a tool, and then told off you go. So I was never get. And so the idea of this book is that practitioners, in a whole range of different fields, right, be it legal, be it health, be it whatever, can almost pick it up and go, oh, I'm about to see somebody with autism. Oh, here's a quick chapter on it. Here's the key points I need to know. Or I'm about to do a capacity assessment. How do I do that? What process do I do? What's the framework? Oh, okay, there we are. Boom, boom, boom. Almost like an assessor's Bible, that you can just pick up, to go to the relevant chapter. It gives you that information just to based on it go, right, okay, I can go and crack on. And so the idea is that, I think I said to you before, whilst I could obviously write the whole thing myself, there are maybe one or two other people out there that have got expertise. So the idea is that I'm going to be putting in all these people, so speech and language therapists, social workers, people like yourself, Andy, that just have got this expertise that can summarize it really well in a chapter or a couple of chapters, that we can just have this easy read, pick up, put down book.
That sounds awesome. Yeah, that sounds really good.
Andy, sounds like you haven't talked about your book, and I think this should be a quick. It's coming out at the end of November, right? Is that right?
It is, yeah. And this episode might come out after that, but don't worry, they'll be hearing about my book a lot, Tim.
Well, I'm really looking forward to reading it. I'm really excited about being able to get a copy when it's released. So.
Fantastic. Well, I'll make sure we'll have to meet up sometime as well. I'll make sure we sign it. Or we'll sign each other's. We could do a joint signing, and I can get your details as well. But yeah, it's been fantastic talking to you. And I think what I would suggest is that obviously this podcast appeals to the paid and unpaid caregiver and teachers and parents. And I think anybody who's supporting somebody, if they're over the age of 16 and they do need some level of support, or there's been a change or some you are worried about their ability to make their decisions because they are in a situation of support and care, whether it be an elderly relative or whether it be, a loved one that's reaching that age that may be moving into the care system. It is really important, both for people who aren't in the industry. I've always found that the Mental Capacity Act for me is a toolkit that I really need to know about. It is kind of part of my armor that this is how I make sure that I'm working in the best interests of the client, the individual I'm supporting, but also it's what protects me. It's my kind of defense against why I made a decision and the process. So I think it is so important that people familiarize themselves with it and have it in their back pocket. And I think your guide is a wonderful way of having access to that without all the jargon and complication and having to read the actual legislation and all that, because it's a bit boring. At least yours is really interesting. So if anybody watching, if you found anything on today's episode interesting, useful, or you feel it could be relevant to somebody else, please like, comment and share. But otherwise, Tim, thank you very much for your time today.
It's been my pleasure, Andy. Been fun. Enjoyed it. Thank you.
My pleasure. Yeah, great chatting to you. Take care.
Cheers, mate. Bye.
Have you ever encountered an adult or child's behaviour that has felt difficult, overwhelming, or challenging? Have you sometimes felt at a loss of what to do, or know that you didn't handle it quite right? People are complex and unpredictable, and their behaviour can be like the weather. We've all made the mistake of looking out the window and feeling safe to wear shorts, but 5 minutes later, wishing for an umbrella. What if, like a weatherman, you understood how humidity, temperature, and pressure all come together to cause the weather, allowing you to better prepare, predict, and respond, and prevent ever having a picnic ruined by a thunderstorm ever again? My book, called Targeting the Positive with Behaviours that Challenge, helps you to become the weatherman of behaviour. It provides you with a toolkit to increase competency, confidence, resilience, and empathy, so you feel more assured about how to respond to distressed or dysregulated behaviours in others, including those affected by trauma, mental health, neurodiversity, learning disabilities, or dementia. Build better connections, achieve de-escalation, and improve outcomes for yourself and those you engage with my celebrated 6-stage target model, a step-by-step process to reduce distress for everyone. Discover my empowering, person-centered guide in Targeting the Positive, written by me, Andy Baker, available from online bookstores worldwide. Find a link in the description and order today.